Welcome to today's session entitled Pay for Success, a tool to finance and support successful aging. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so that you know how to participate in today's event. When you joined today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you'd like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in the control panel. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's panelists by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions in at any time. We will collect those and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce John Feather, CEO of Grantmakers in Aging and moderator for today's event. John?
Thank you, Kat. And I'm delighted that so many of you have decided to join us today. As always, we want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation, whose generous support allows us to provide this webinar free of charge to our audience. Pay for success, or pay for results, or social impact bonds, or a number of other terms, have been around for a number of years and have been seen as a new way for funders to do their work, particularly around complex social issues. And it presents attractive opportunities for funders in the aging space to serve as catalysts to seed and scale proven interventions in new and promising ways. To introduce this financial instrument, we are joined today, and we're very grateful for their participation, Ellie Hollander, who is the President and CEO of Meals on Wheels America, Eric Letzinger, who is the CEO of Quantified Ventures, Michael Shaw, Program Officer with the KRESGE Foundation, and Lucy Teilheimer, the Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at Meals on Wheels America. We welcome all of you. As Kat said, and was previously mentioned, please at any time begin writing in your questions on the question box that you see on the panel that you have on your screen. Those will be read to the presenters as we go to the question and answer period at the end of the hour. So Ellie, let's begin with you.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks to Emily as well for the opportunity to be here with you today. And I'd like to add my appreciation to yours, John, to the John A. Hartford Foundation for supporting these conversations with Grantmakers in Aging. These webinar series, I think, are really a wonderful way for all of us to sort of stay up to date on the latest and greatest developments. And this is really ideal timing, I think, for Grantmakers in Aging to know more about these alternative financing instruments, which can advance important work in the senior aging space, particularly since we all know that there's a paucity of philanthropy being directed toward aging. I always remember what you told me years ago, John, and Shelley Lyford has mentioned many, many times, that less than 1.5% of philanthropy is directed toward aging. So given the fact that there's limited funds, we want to maximize and optimize any opportunity that's presented to us. So given the desire for funders to leverage their investments to help solve social problems, this is one more arrow in your quiver as funders, I think, to help bring evidence-based interventions to scale. And John, as you and I discussed early on, few funders have the assets of like a Bill Gates Foundation. But with social impact bonds or pay for success, you don't have to make multi-million-dollar investments to seed good work that can be replicated from community to community and state to state. So I got intrigued with this option because I saw the concept work beautifully in the electric utility industry, where I worked for almost 20 years, believe it or not, when energy efficient lighting had just been introduced. So buildings, for example, were paying thousands of dollars a year in electricity bills just to keep the lights on, literally. To retrofit a building with energy efficient lighting at that time was quite costly. So the idea of performance-based contracts became really in vogue, where a utility or an energy services company could offer to replace all the existing lighting with energy efficient compact fluorescents. Remember those days? Well, anyway, doing so would significantly reduce energy bills, improve overall lighting and the environment. So the utility would incur the upfront cost of retrofitting the building's lighting and would get paid back from the energy savings plus a return. And this was pretty commonplace when I was in the energy business. So when I came to Meals on Wheels America 5 years ago, I wondered Why can't we apply the same concept to interventions that improve outcomes and save money in the aging space? So today, to demystify pay for success social impact bonds, I have with me what I consider to be a very distinguished panel who will really explain in as simply as possible what pay for success is, how it works, where it stands, why funders should be interested, and how it's being used and could be used to advance successful aging. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric to talk about what pay for success is.
Fantastic. Thanks, Allie, and thanks, John. Looking forward to a good conversation today. If we could, why don't we move on to slide 3, and we'll talk a little bit about where this capital comes from. A nice simple graph to just basically say, hey, there's lots of it, and it's growing, right? But to understand the source of this, I think it's worth understanding where this comes from. As we all know, we are in the middle of the largest wealth transfer in the history of the planet, and as trillions of dollars is flowing from baby boomers to Gen Xers to their millennial kids, the values of those younger generations in terms of how they want to see their wealth deployed is changing dramatically. Where the baby boomers might have been more comfortable with, I work really hard for my money over here in this one part of my life, and in the other area of my life over here, I give my money away to my favorite charity. The younger generations are looking for something different. And as they are controlling more and more of this wealth, what they're looking for in the middle is to invest their wealth in social challenges, health challenges, environmental challenges. They want a return. They may or may not want a lower return, may be satisfied with a sub-market return. But in exchange for that delta, they want this thing which is rigorously measured outcomes. And so they're, as these younger generations are perhaps less impressed with the model of giving your money away and looking for outcomes to be generated through investments, that's what's causing this big spike in this new source of capital called impact investing. Let's move on to slide 4 and let's talk a little bit more about that. I'm sorry, slide 6 there. In the it's a frustrated source of capital, and that's a generic branding, just in the sense that it's new. Not only is there lots of it, it's new and it's shaping itself every day. And let's talk about some of the reasons why this capital is frustrated. But the bottom line message here is that the social impact bond model, or the pay for success model, or the environmental impact bond model, by the way, those are 3 different words for the same model, which is what we're going to talk about today. This model addresses a lot of these frustrated elements of the capital that we're talking about here. So at the end of the day, there's a disconnect in risk and return. There's a shortage of investments for this new source of capital to invest in. That nets out to there is more capital than there are transactions for them to invest in. There's a lack of a common vocabulary, a lack of deal structures, and then lack of research, data, and skills, and an inability to measure impact. Those are the areas that slow down the progression of this impact capital finding its way onto the field. And the good news is, like I said, I think the social impact bond, or the pay for success model, is one vehicle that can scratch a lot of those frustrated itches. Let's move on to slide 7, if we could. And we will talk briefly about what the model looks like, and in general, how it works. And we've had the great luxury of working with Meals on Wheels to structure a series of these transactions around the country, and we'll get deeper into those transactions. But I just wanted to start with the generic model to make sure that we're all singing from the same sheet of music. At the end of the day, we've got an investor up at the top there. And there are a range of impact investment funds out there, many housed in 501c3 impact funds, many housed in large banks up in New York, and everything in between. We look for, on the right there, you've got a service provider, in this case, Meals on Wheels. What we at Quantified Ventures look for are service providers who have an evidence base that basically says, by way of delivering their intervention, they drive value to that player on the left that we refer to as the payer. And oftentimes that payer can be a health plan or a hospital or a government agency. And that value that is being delivered by way of the service provider just delivering their normal intervention on a daily basis, that value can manifest itself in the form of increased revenue, savings, or merely health outcomes that are valued by that payer. And in theory, if we were to scale up and drive capital to that service provider, that payer would save more money or make more money or achieve or realize an increased volume of those health outcomes that were predicted. And when that payer is unwilling to just contract directly with that service provider for a variety of reasons, right? The data is not as compelling or they've got other priorities. When that payer is not willing to contract directly to scale up the service provision, then we go find that investor, that third party, to actually provide that capital to be spent by the service provider to scale up their intervention. And then before the transaction begins, the player in the middle, the evaluator, we design essentially the rules of the road, right? And we design an evaluation model that's going to measure two things: not only the health outcomes that are associated with the participants that the service provider delivers services to, but also the economic outputs, meaning did the payer save the amount of money that we predicted it would, or did they make the revenue that we predicted they would? And so everybody at the beginning of this transaction, all four players, the investor, the service provider, and the payer, agreed to that evaluation model. And then when the project begins, when we fire the starting gun, the capital moves from the investor to the service provider. The service provider does their thing that they do so well, right? And then the evaluator is measuring whether the predicted outcomes actually transpire, and when or if they do, then it's out of those savings pools or increased revenue. The payer then pays back the investor in the form of success payments. At the end of the day, at Quantified Ventures, we are a transaction coordinator, and we do these transactions across the health sector, the education sector, and the environmental sector. And we work by pulling all of these parties together and moving through a very efficient methodology from idea to transaction close. And if we could, let's move on to slide 8, and we'll summarize this a bit, and then we'll hear from Michael Shaw. Just in general, what we just talked about, in general, pay for success, one of the things that we really like about the model is that the more you stare at that cartoon picture that we just went through, you realize that everybody's interests are quite aligned, in the sense that everybody wants it to work out, right? Service providers putting their reputation on the line that says that when they provide that service, these certain outcomes happen. The investor wants it to work out because when they're betting their capital that by way of moving their capital to the service provider, certain outcomes will be achieved. So they certainly want those outcomes to be achieved because that's how they're getting paid back. And in general, that payer, whether it's a hospital system or a government agency, they value those outcomes that are predicted. They want those outcomes to achieve. They're in the business of those outcomes being realized and scaling. So everybody has a common incentive for the transaction to work, which is one of the things that we like about the model. In general, the payer only pays back the investor if agreed upon outcomes are achieved. So in plain English, that means that the investor is taking the financial risk. And then a rigorous independent evaluation of the outcomes is required. Everybody wants rigorous evaluation. Again, if you sort of stare at that cartoon picture and you realize what undergirds that alignment is a fair and rigorous and comprehensive evaluation model. And one of the tenets, I would say that's sort of one of the tenets of the Pay for Success model. And one of the things that we like about the model is that for every social impact bond that transpires, we're adding to the library of evidence for the service provider and those are often difficult funding. Those are often difficult nickels and dimes to find out there in the world to actually fund rigorous evaluations, and this model can be one way of doing that. And then just to make sure that we're being clear here, there's lead time necessary to structure these deals. These aren't just snapping our fingers and then we move on the next day. There's quite a bit of work to pull these together, but they're worth it. They're worth it for a couple reasons. Number one, you've got an ability to sort of attract this new source of capital to mission-driven work, and then number two, at the end of the transaction, the theory is that that payer, let's say the transaction works out and the outcomes produced and everybody's happy, then the payer now has the evidence that they would need to justify moving forward with a direct contract with a service provider. So that's one of the things that we like about the model. With that brief overview, why don't I turn it over to Michael Shaw, who's a program officer at KRESGE Foundation. He has been one of the Pay for Success experts in this country from the beginning of its inception when it came over from the UK in about 2012. He's going to talk a little bit more broadly about the field and the role that foundations can play in advancing this model. Michael?
Thanks, Eric. It's always fun to collaborate with you and the Quantified Ventures team. I think I'll try to be brief. I think my role here is to talk a bit about what's happening with the tool in the field. Where's it going? Where's it been? Is it just a flash? Is it going to stick around? Talk a little bit about why KRESGE has embraced it. You know, what's the case? What's the justification? Why do we care? And how have we seen philanthropy play a role in advancing it? So this tool became active under the last administration, and some people may be curious if it remains, if it retains any of the momentum through the transition. The short answer, yes, it actually does. We were a little nervous, but it continues to roll on. Pay for Success and the movement for outcomes-based contracting or outcomes-based financing or whatever we want to call it these days continues forward with bipartisan support. We've seen about 20 deals close and operating across the U.S., so it's still early days, but we see dozens more in the pipeline in places that are already familiar with the tool, like LA, Boston, and Connecticut. But we also see it in places that may surprise you, like in Oklahoma, and in Tennessee, in Memphis, and Nashville, and in Texas, in Austin, and in Houston, and in different places. We've seen a doubling down of engagement at the federal level, which kind of surprised us in many ways. This is seen in the passing of this thing called the Social Impact Partnerships to Pay for Results Act, or CIPRA for short, which is a $100 million allocation of new money that came out of the recent budget negotiation. This CIPRA funding is something that we pushed very hard for, and the last administration couldn't get through. And we're quite excited when we saw this new allocation come from the past Budget Act. Also in the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018, we saw a reauthorization of the Maternal Infant Early Child Home Visiting Program, or MICV for short. It was a reauthorization for 5 years, which is the longest reauthorization to date, and allows the option for states to enter into Pay for Success contracts for home visiting and use up to 25% of the MICV funding for outcomes-based payments. It's an incredible change. We also saw progression in the Family Prevention Services Act, which provides sweeping reforms to federal funding and support for child welfare services, with particular emphasis on defining and redirecting funds towards evidence-based programming. But the real action continues to heat up at the state and local level. We're seeing a rapid uptake of policy related to data leadership, data use, data sharing policies, performance management, continuous improvement, evaluation leadership. There's actually new staffing positions within governor's office and county administrators' offices, cost-benefit analysis, and more. All the fundamental elements that help make this transition over to an outcomes-based world, which helps facilitate these cool things called Pay for Success deals. So while we've seen this erosion of social innovation dollars at the federal level, which had been the primary source for fueling the early days of this work, we have seen the opportunity to engage more deeply at the agency level, which is actually very exciting because it's more permanent dollars, more structural dollars, and work more closely at the state and local level to propel the work. Next slide, please. So why did KRESGE get involved? And how can philanthropy support this to have positive value for people? For us, it's actually all about people, and it's about impact. KRESGE is a national foundation that's focused on expanding opportunity for people with low income in American cities. We look for opportunities to work across sector to address racial equity and to leverage various forms of capital. That includes grants, PRIs, MRIs, and our own influence platform. Our human services program, which I predominantly work on, has a long focus on expanding social and economic mobility for kids and families and strengthening the human services sector to enable it. And those two things go together really well. We've recognized over a long time that we can't program our way out of poverty, that we have some really critical infrastructure issues to address to ensure that the service provision apparatus in our country is actually working to address poverty and mobility. However, it was built with the best of intentions on a model of charity that has resulted in a system that is prescriptive and paternalistic. We see the potential of Pay for Success to accelerate the orientation on the sector from one of volume, which rewards how many people in how many ways and how many places we're served, to one of value, which is around enduring impact. We also recognize that this requires some subtle and some significant shifts in how the sector operates and delivers services. It requires the government to procure differently. It requires for providers to operate under a different set of incentives, and for the intervention beneficiaries, the real people, to have more power, more agency, and more voice in those services. We recognize that change is difficult. We also often understand that it's often untenable from a business and a political perspective. So Pay for Success provides an opportunity for piloting, testing, and improving practice differently. It can mitigate some of the risks of the public sector in making these changes, one of the reasons why they don't embrace change very often. It can test new and expanded approaches, something public sector is not very good at and that the nonprofit sector doesn't usually have the capital for. And it can attract new investors and partners to supporting the public good. Next slide, please. So what have we done? How has KRESGE done this? What can philanthropy do? Don't be frightened by the price tag of the investment numbers. They're big, I know. They're simply meant to show you that we have invested deeply in many ways in this work. Some directly and some less directly. We've invested both grant capital and PRI capital directly into deals and adjacent to deals. We've invested in deals such as Center for Employment Opportunities, which is attempting to address recidivism in workforce. It's a deal that's operating in New York, but is looking to replicate to a variety of places across the country. Or the JVS deal in Boston, which is working to connect immigrant populations to the workforce. But we've also invested in field building and what I call the adjacencies. These include building the strength of the sector intermediaries, the organizations that are helping facilitate the outgrowth of this marketplace in a responsible manner. We've also invested in toolkits and leadership development efforts and demonstration projects, and we've provided matching grant dollars, but also we've been making general operating grants to providers who are mission critical to us that are pursuing this work. We know that this is hard for organizations to implement, and having a bit more cushion and resources is essential for them being successful. We've also used our platform, our voice, our experience. This includes showing up as an advisor to other foundations, to different groups of foundations, including California's Pay for Success Initiative, which was funded by Irvine and run by Nonprofit Finance Fund, showing up for them, being present, challenging, even if we weren't investing directly. We are also asking really hard questions of our providers and our grantees and providing information to public leaders. My ask to you guys in the philanthropic community is that you appreciate that this movement is happening. It holds great potential for getting to better outcomes. It comes at the risk of execution. When we actually see this transition through, how can we support it? And for you guys to consider how you and your grantees can navigate embracing this new posture, how you might contribute to it, and where your investments can get the greatest value. For us, while not every investment is around Pay for Success, we try really, really hard to use it as a lens. How are our organizations, whether they're policy, whether they're providers, regardless of what they're doing, how are they thinking about stewarding or navigating towards this orientation of outcomes? How can our dollars help them get there more smoothly and more effectively? So that's what we're up to. Open to questions and open to talking to you guys if you have any questions. And from that, I'll transition to Lucy from Meals on Wheels to tell you about how how they're using the tool to advance their work and mission.
Michael, and good afternoon, everybody. While I will be focused largely on Meals on Wheels and our experience in Pay for Success, I did want to take just a moment to point out that this approach is really applicable to the broad range of aging issues that I know you all are facing every day and as part of your mission. So we know from many years of service delivery and evaluation efforts that interventions such as these that are shown on this slide are making a difference for individuals, particularly frail, vulnerable seniors, enabling them to stay independent and out of high-cost institutions, which is not where they want to be. So issues like medication adherence or transportation or social isolation or fall prevention, whatever your particular interest is, this can be an opportunity for you to advance your mission and your priorities. Next slide, please. So I'm going to delve into Meals on Wheels on our intervention. First, I wanted to point out that I believe, to our knowledge, we are the first Pay for Success effort in the aging space. And we have been building our evidence base for many years. And this is important, particularly in Pay for Success. The evidence base, the ability to prove that the intervention that you are focused on is having an impact, is critical to attract the attention of payers and investors. So building that evidence base is really critical, yet it is something that's very difficult and challenging for nonprofit organizations to do. Experimental and quasi-experimental research is expensive. Randomized control trials are expensive, and that in itself is a barrier. And I'm sure many of you receive proposals all the time seeking funds to help organizations build their evidence base. Just to give you a little bit of a highlight on terms of some of our evidence base as we started to look at this, we had information resulting from several projects. One was our Community Connections project, where we demonstrated that more than 50% of clients reported improved health and ability to live independently in the community within 2 months of receiving Meals on Wheels services. In our Feel Good Food project, which actually delivered one-time 10-pack of meals and a follow-up phone call for over a 2-week period, actually showed post-discharge costs reduced by 1/3 in that short period of time. We had a project with Walmart, and it was called the Vision Grants, that demonstrated that 30-day readmission rates post-intervention range from 6 to 7% compared to the national readmission rate at that time of 15 to 33%. And our randomized controlled trial, More Than a Meal research project that was conducted with support from Brown University, demonstrated self-rated improvement in mental and physical health, reduction in the rate of falls and hospitalizations, improvement in feelings of isolation and loneliness, and decreases in worrying about ability to remain independent at home for those who were receiving the daily Meals on Wheels services compared to those who were only receiving a one-time shipment of frozen meals or were on a waiting list and not receiving services at all. All this is to say is the ability to quantify the impact becomes particularly important in this Pay for Success world. And it's an opportunity, I think, that we all share in trying to build that evidence base. Next slide, please. Meals on Wheels America is a national membership association. We are not a direct service provider. Our goal and reason for being is to make it possible for the network of local programs across the country to be able to reach and have impact on the millions of seniors who are out there struggling with hunger and isolation every day. And that was the driving reason that Ellie brought us into the Pay for Success world, as we saw this as an opportunity to continue to build that evidence base and ultimately to build a sustained source of revenue for these local programs so that they can deliver the services that are so needed. So what is the challenge that we're facing? And this is probably not news to most of you. This is all around. We know there's a rapidly growing high need and a high-risk senior population. People are living longer. They're coping with more and more chronic conditions. We know that federal funding has stayed flat through the Older Americans Act, and that programs like Meals on Wheels and many other community-based providers are having to rely on philanthropy and other kinds of fundraising efforts to try to fill in that gap, and they still fall woefully short of being able to meet the need. The nonprofit community in some ways is really competing with each other for this share of philanthropic dollars. And there's more and more increased competition with for-profit providers that are able to build economic models that are challenging for nonprofits who don't have quite the margin and the capacity of those kinds of organizations. I did have on here, I did want to point out that it says under challenge on this slide that there's increased emphasis on social determinants of health. The reason I didn't mention that first is I actually really think that that's an opportunity and not a challenge. I think recently in the world of social services and healthcare, it's become recognized and accepted that what happens outside the doctor's office and what happens outside a hospital setting is as important, if not more important or more impactful on an individual's overall health and well-being as it is when they're in those acute care settings. Now that that's recognized, healthcare is interested in partnering with community-based organizations, in part because the incentives for them have shifted, and now they're being paid on achieving outcomes and reducing costs rather than a fee-for-service model. That creates an opportunity for programs like Meals on Wheels to leverage investor capital and to begin to partner with healthcare entities to demonstrate the value that Meals on Wheels can offer in improving those healthcare outcomes and reducing costs. So we have that in our evidence base, and now that opportunity exists for us. And our primary target is really to leverage the opportunity with healthcare and to position Meals on Wheels as an integral point on that continuum of care to meet the needs of high-risk, vulnerable seniors. Next slide, please. So early on, as Ellie pointed out from her personal experience, she recognized that there was this opportunity and wanted to pursue the extent to which pay for success could work in our world. And we engaged with Quantified Ventures to conduct a feasibility assessment, which resulted in our conclusion of, yes, we actually had made the case and could make the case to both payers and investors that Meals on Wheels had an impact and a savings opportunity for different kinds of healthcare providers. We started out by targeting a risk-bearing hospital system in the state of Maryland as our payer. That's in essence, the organization that will benefit from the delivery of the services that Meals on Wheels can provide. We engaged Meals on Wheels of Central Maryland that services the Baltimore area to work with Johns Hopkins Bayview Medical Center to define what was it that was important to Johns Hopkins, what were their major concerns, what were their pain points, how could Meals on Wheels help them address those pain points, and then if and only if Meals on Wheels helped them solve for those problems, Johns Hopkins Bayview would then reimburse an investor who was fronting the money to Meals on Wheels of Central Maryland to deliver those services. So we worked together to define what those outcomes were. And in this case, it was reduction in use of emergency rooms, it was hospital admissions, it was reducing hospital readmissions, which is a major issue that Johns Hopkins and actually every hospital across the country is facing. We engaged an outside evaluator. To Eric's point, rigorous evaluation is important here and independent evaluation is important. We engaged the Urban Institute. We brought them in early on to help us define the outcomes and to develop the way we would measure the extent to which we had achieved those outcomes. And that would become the proof to Johns Hopkins that yes, we had delivered and now you can repay the investor. We identified an investor in the Baltimore area as well to support the project. We are actually now in the middle of pilot testing our project to make sure that everything we've designed with Johns Hopkins is working according to plan before the clock actually starts ticking on a pay for success project, and we will be held accountable for achieving those outcomes that we've agreed to with Johns Hopkins Bayview. Next slide. So as I said, our goal is really to help our local programs. And when we do something in one location, our goal is often to figure out, can we make this work for the network? It's a starting point for us to basically capture learnings, document everything we did so that we can then package it and go help other programs across the country develop these kinds of projects and secure funding to prove their worth, if you will, in their community. And every community is different, and every healthcare payer is different. So we set out to actually put together some additional projects, and we now have 3 projects fully underway. We're the Baltimore project that I just described to you. We are working with a Medicare Advantage plan to test an offering through them. We're very excited about that. It'll be the first time to tap into Medicare funds. It also offers an opportunity for scaling across the country that could be hugely impactful. And we also have a third project that we're working on in New Jersey, where we're just actually starting out and looking at even different kinds of payers. And all the while, we're capturing all the learnings and documenting everything so that we will be able to share them across the country with anybody who's interested. So next slide, just to sum up, I do believe, and I started this cold, I knew nothing when I came into this, and I had to learn all of this. And it seemed scary at first, but it became less and less scary because it became so intuitively obvious. In our conversations with Johns Hopkins, it is clear to me that no matter what happens, Johns Hopkins is going to be providing ongoing financial support to Meals on Wheels of Central Maryland. We have made such a compelling case through this project that they will be a sustainable source of funding for the patients that they refer to Meals on Wheels of Central Maryland. So it does represent a meaningful opportunity in many ways to advance the ball. As Michael just commented, the environment is shifting. Passage of CIPRA reflects that this is something that crosses the aisle in terms of interest, and we can leverage that. It provides a way to build that evidence base. Every project we do just adds to that evidence base. And foundations do have a role to play in helping to make PFS viable, pay for success viable for aging service providers who seek to scale. We've got some opportunities going. There's other opportunities out there. If anybody is interested in them, you can email me offline and I'll be happy to talk with you specifically. But there are now new and innovative and interesting opportunities. So I encourage people to stick a toe in the water, because the reality is you can really literally stick a toe. You don't have to play big as a first effort. You can just start small, learn, and see how it fits for you in advancing the mission of your organization. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to John to start us.
Well, thank you. Well, thank you to all of our speakers, a very engaging and succinct account of what can be sometimes an intimidating amount of information. And Lucy, I'm going to start with the first question, which seems specifically directed at your last point. It says, pay for success seems like an enormous effort to implement a single project. Do its benefits outweigh spending that same amount of effort advocating to a payer to directly invest in the service?
That's a great question. And one doesn't preclude the other, but the reality is advocating to a payer doesn't always get you there, doesn't always get you to the goal line. So in our case in Baltimore, actually, we had a very Johns Hopkins Bayview couldn't be more supportive. The president of Johns Hopkins Bayview is a geriatrician. His senior advisor is a geriatric psychologist. They were totally bought in, and they already had invested in their community, yet they still have to prove to other stakeholders that this is a worthwhile investment for them to make. And that's what the project really offered them, was an opportunity for them to also be able to advocate within their own systems to invest in these services. So I think if one doesn't preclude the other, you want to continue to do both. And there have been times when the advocating for the payer to pay directly has actually worked, and they've said, okay, we're not going to do pay for success, we're just going to pay for this, and that's wonderful. Then we don't have to go through the pay for success.
John, if I could jump in, and I bet Eric wants to too, it's Ellie here, is, what this is really giving a comfort level, in a sense, to payers to put more skin in the game and to understand that if there is a separate investor and Pay for Success is sort of the protective shield, if you will, they've hedged their risk. But then they begin to realize, and Eric will talk about this, I think, that in fact, well, wait a minute, there is a return on this. And if I fund this myself, I can reap the total benefit of the return on these savings versus having to pay back an investor. And I think Eric told me at the very beginning that a lot of times you go down this road in a Pay for Success mode to kind of, I don't know, socialize the ideas Lucy was saying with the key people in the health plan or the hospital system, and they may end up switching from Pay for Success in the middle over to paying for it straight out. Eric, do you want to add to that? Because I think you've made this point before.
Yeah, sure, Ellie, and you both have it right. We would argue it's the same process. I would say 80% of our methodology for developing a Pay for Success project exactly mirrors the methodology for convincing a system to pay for the service providers. So therefore, and to Ellie's point, we have many of these transactions that end not by culminating in a Pay for Success transaction, but actually by, after meeting number 12, having the system stand up and say, could somebody please explain why we're making this so complicated? Why don't they just buy the service directly? This is what we asked them to do in meeting number 1, but they weren't ready to. And by using the carrot of a private investor to actually take off and shoulder the financial risk, a little bit of stress out of that conversation, and you're able to march down a path very emotional way. And then oftentimes that payer, whether it's a healthcare system or a government agency, finds themselves more comfortable with the evidence and more comfortable with the ROI by going to that less emotional, less salesy process associated with the advocacy.
Well, thanks to all of you for that. Michael, this is a question I think probably goes to you as a funder here. I work for a regional foundation, and our trustees are skeptical of different methods of using our resources that are not the traditional grant resource methods. So the question is, how do you convince trustees who often come from a specific model of giving away money in the foundation world that this is a better approach to meeting the needs of their community?
Yeah, well, we have a unique advantage in that our board gets this, right? And that doesn't go for everybody. Educating them that, there's little risk, educating them that they're leaving opportunity on the table, that they're not fully flexing the breadth of the toolbox that they have available to them, and encouraging them. Most of our trustees are not in philanthropy themselves. They're generally in the private sector, often sometimes in the public sector, and in their day jobs, they would be looking to leverage the breadth of their own toolbox, including capital sources. So while we're often very, very protective of the precious resources of philanthropy, we can't do that in spite of improving and expanding on the quality of work we can deliver. And then there's the opportunity of how do you get them closer without actually getting there, right? So while you're educating them along the way, how do you show them little nuggets of progress in the right direction? Whether it's, we start screening our grantee partners for how they're moving in this direction and building the case that this is an undue burden that's being put on them, this pivot to it, and we need to respond to it. Or being able to share with them, a reflection on where the policy agenda is going or where the actual need and demand is in communities, outstripping for us to keep up with just traditional philanthropic sources. So it's case making, it's informing, and then it's you guys being creative to get closer in the middle.
Well, great. We have a couple questions about probably what is a fairly basic part of this process, which is once you come to an agreement, somebody is paying for Meals on Wheels to provide this service. Who is that? And if the project doesn't work, does Meals on Wheels reimburse for the expenses they've been paid already to provide those meals?
I can take that. This is Eric. It's a great question, and thanks for asking it. Just to make sure that we're all comfortable with how it works. The investor is taking the financial risk. The service provider is not taking financial risk. So in plain English, what does that mean? It means once that money goes from the investor to the service provider is supposed to spend it. Spend it all. Do your thing. And then if it turns out that what that investor thought was going to happen, meaning those health outcomes or those increased revenues or savings to the payer, if it turns out that doesn't happen, the service provider is not on the hook to return any of that capital. That capital is spent in an investment sort of way.
Okay, great. Any comments from Lucy or Ellie or anybody?
No, I think Eric's got it.
Okay. So I think for many service providers, this is obviously an enormous issue to make sure that they know exactly what they're responsible for through this process. A question, I think, probably back to Lucy. Your first slide alluded to a number of issues within aging that might fit into this model. Are you seeing other aging-related programs come into this besides the one on Meals on Wheels that you described?
John, interestingly, I have not seen other aging providers. I think that there are some organizations that are exploring it, but I haven't seen anything get beyond the exploratory phase at this point.
I think part of it is, it's Ellie jumping in here, also that you need to have an intervention where you have some evidence base that there is either savings to be had or outcomes to be achieved and so forth. And I think that we're pursuing, I say we, meaning the aging partners, are looking at other opportunities to do this. We believe that there are. I just don't think that anything yet that we're aware of has come to the fore. Lucy has something to add.
I would add one other thing, and Eric, maybe you can jump in here. And it relates to also the CIPRA funding. We were fortunate in that we were able to secure 2 different grants through the Nonprofit Finance Fund that was funded through the White House monies in the last administration, the Social Innovation Fund. And what it does takes, as Eric said, it takes some lead time and it takes some investing. You have to hire an evaluator. You have to pay for an evaluator. There's time to be paid for. There's legal work to be done to construct the deals. And so those are costs that have to be borne by somebody. So we've been able to get funding for all 3 of those projects that are in play now by another funder to help us be able to advance this work. And that may be another challenge that's keeping things slowed down. I know that Quantified Ventures is very interested in looking at how can we remove those kinds of barriers for these kinds of projects. Eric, do you want to add anything to that?
I'll add one thing, which is one of the things that's been a real treat about working with Meals on Wheels of America, is that our mission here at Quantified Ventures, we are all about just scaling what works, right? And if a pay for success transaction can be a vehicle towards scaling interventions across the country that are Meals on Wheels interventions, that's what we're all about. The work that we've undertaken and our model is to transfer the knowledge of how to structure these to our clients. So we have been working with Meals on Wheels of America over this past stretch, not just to make them dependent on Quantified Ventures to do the 7th, 8th, and 9th, and 10th transaction, but to be very intentional about transferring the methodology and building the capacity internally within Meals on Wheels of America, so that when we're done with the 3rd, 4th, or 5th transaction, they no longer are reliant on an intermediary to actually do transaction number 8 through number 300. They can do those themselves.
Great. Well, thank you for that. Could we move on to the next slide? Because several of you have asked for the contact information for our speakers, so there you have it on the screen. And I think we will have time for a couple more questions, and then I'll turn it back to our panelists for their final comments. So the question is, and any of you that would like to talk about this can do this one. It seems that it makes more sense to work on specific areas with a strong evidence base. Many of the problems that we tackle are more intransigent social issues, drug addiction, chronic homelessness being examples. Are these areas where it's just too complicated and too difficult to measure to likely to be useful in this area?
This is Lucy. I jump in here. From absolutely not, I would say. I would say those are the kinds of social problems that I think different entities are looking at Pay for Success for. In fact, I think homelessness, there are a number of Pay for Success projects around solving for homelessness for the long term, right? So it's not just about how you build shelters, but how do you help people basically secure a future so they don't become homeless again. Eric may have more information on some of these other projects, but I think those are problems, social problems that do lend themselves, as again, still requiring the evidence base that the intervention that's being deployed is having the desired impact that in turn is likely to save somebody money. And in those cases, it's likely to be governments, right? State and local governments, which I think is exactly what CIPRA is aimed at trying to foster. Eric, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I would just also add that type of question, meaning is there an outcome metric that can be financed? Those are some of the very basic questions that are answered in that early stage feasibility work. I think when this model started in the United States, we got off the interesting start in the sense that people were charging hundreds of thousands of dollars to do these unbelievable feasibility assessments, and transactions wouldn't happen. Very efficiently, and just to the point where we have a directional, framed out, viable transaction. And what does that mean? It means it doesn't require a significant investment of capital or funding to actually move through that feasibility stage where you're getting answers to the kind of questions that you're asking. Is there an outcome that is desired by a specific payer? We have an appetite at Quantified Ventures for bending our transactions. Why? Because when you can find an outcome that drives back to a health system, you're able to have a conversation with the CFO who manages the P&L state, which basically means you're having a business conversation and an emotional conversation. Things tend to move faster when you're able to angle your transactions to the health system, that they're incredibly simple to deal with, and not bending it to government agencies like Medicaid and Medicare offices. You're then getting out of some of the complexities associated with procurement and multi-year appropriation risks and other challenges associated with doing these where the government is the payer.
Well, thanks. Michael, the last question is going to go to you. And the question is around most of the programs that we hear about, including this one, obviously, are more nationally based. Are you seeing successes at the local level? You actually talked about that a little bit, that are equally compelling, whether they're in aging or not?
And it's a great question, right? And the reason why you're seeing it start that way, right? And part of the reason why you're seeing these big, somewhat efficient projects early on is because anytime you have the early phase of an innovation, you have the folks show up and things are expensive to start, right? Because they're untemplated and untrue. Yeah, a lot of the big providers and resources for this who have shown up to this early on. There's family partnerships, Center for Employment Opportunities, organizations that have some level of scale. What we're seeing now is as local government actors get into play, that they're finding better, more efficiently procure and leverage local providers. So yeah, we're seeing it. Look at the County, Cleveland, they used all local providers. If you look at the Santa Clara deal, they used a provider called Abode Services. Right? So they weren't all using. We're seeing a lot of evidence within the local organization that we just hadn't been able to identify before or percolate before. So I think you can find it. I think you just need, and I'll say this in my closing remarks, ask a lot of questions of your local nonprofit community.
Well, with that, unfortunately, we have to move on to our closing comments from each of our speakers. And Lucy, we'll start with you.
Impact
Lucy?
and to drive towards their. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so you dropped off for a second. Go ahead.
Okay, no, I was just saying that I do think that Pay for Success presents an opportunity for foundations to exponentially increase their impact and advance their strategic priorities. And so like I said before, I would encourage people to stick a baby toe in the water, learn more, and see how it might work for you.
Well, thanks. Michael?
Ask questions, talk to your grantees. At the very least, ask them if they've heard of it, what they think they're going to do about it, if anything, or play bigger. I'm happy to talk to you about how you do that. Be skeptical. It's okay to be skeptical, be hard on the tool, but know that it's moving in this direction and figure out how to make that appropriate. And then, the senior space has been underdeveloped, actually. We haven't seen a lot of funders here helping to shape it and craft it and build the opportunities in it. And while we don't actually make in the space, I encourage you guys to explore how you could.
Thanks. Then could we have Eric?
Sure. Couple closing thoughts. Number one, I would say these are not rocket science. I'm not saying, they're not faint of heart. They're not rocket science either. I would say the hardest part is getting started. I think we all grew up in an era where we thought we had everything figured out and planned beautifully before we execute. That's not how these things work. These things work by 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So what does that mean? It means getting started. Going from 0 to 1 is the hardest part. And for those brave entities like Meals on Wheels, they seem to be enjoying some of the fruits of that labor. And fortune favors the brave. I think that's what I'll close with.
Well, thanks so much. Ellie, you have the final word.
Sure. First of all, thanks so much for everyone for hanging in there. Some of the sound didn't sound great, so I hope if you weren't able to understand some of the comments that were made, please feel free to follow up with any of us so we can clarify. My intent here in wanting to bring this to grant makers and aging was I really do think, as Lucy said, that the time is now, and this is an opportunity for foundations to really scale the work that they're doing in ways that can be replicated, not only in community by community, but state by state and nationwide. And I believe for successful aging, we absolutely need to leave no stone unturned, given the fact that funding is limited and it's not moving in the right direction. I would also say 2 quick things. One is a special shout out to AARP Foundation and to West Health and the Gary Mary West Foundation, because those organizations really have helped Meals on Wheels to invest in the evidence base and some of the research that we referred to help give us a good bearing that there are outcomes and savings to be had. So I want to thank them. And lastly, there's a great article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review that came out on December 12th in 2017 that I encourage you to read. It really does simplify what can sound like a very complex financial instrument but it really does make sense, as Eric said. And our goal is to really encourage you to give this a shot, and we're happy to be available to you later on. Thank you very much, John.
Well, thanks to all of you. I do want to thank Ellie Hollander, Eric Letzinger, Michael Shaw, and Lucy Teilheimer for being on the program with us today and for sharing their expertise. We thank you all for what you do to make life better for older adults and people of all ages. We also want to thank the Johnny Hartford Foundation for their support of this program today and throughout our entire series. Please join us for our next webinar, which is Thursday, March 22nd, which is entitled Social Isolation, Impact and Age-Friendly Interventions, which is part of our Age-Friendly Communities webinar series. You can find out more information on our website. We do make these presentations available to anyone who wishes to view them later, including both the slides and the audio. Watch for the rebroadcast link on our website. And finally, I want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Have a great day.